مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. الأصل الأمريكي. منذ نشأة أمريكا شكل المشكلة الأكثر صعوبة وتأكيدا وإيلاما على الصعيد السياسي وفي المجتمع. وفقا للدستور الأمريكي مثل السود العبيد ما لا يزيد عن 3/5 شخص. بعد جيلين خاضت بلادنا حربها الأكثر دموية لتحديد ما إذا كان ذلك صحيحا أم خطأ. بعد قرن من تلك الحرب أصدرت المحكمة العليا أخيرا قرارها بعدم جواز الفصل بين السود والبيض في المدارس. وبعد نصف قرن من ذلك القرار وحتى بعدما تم انتخاب الرجل أسود مرتين ليكون رئيسا للبلاد، تبقى العلاقات بين أمريكا البيضاء والسوداء متوترة. كما تدل الأحداث التي وقعت في بلدة فيرغسون في ولاية ميزوري يمكن أن يصبح النزاع بين البيض والسود أحيانا عنيفا. ما مدى التقدم الذي اخرزته أمريكا فيما يخص العلاقات بين العراق؟ إلى أي مدى ما يزال يلزمها المضي؟ هل الكوب نصف ممتلئ أم نصف فارغ؟ لمناقشة هذه التساؤلات الهامة يسرني أن أرحب في برنامج داخل واشنطن بواحد من كبار خبراء أمريكا في مسألة الجوانب السياسية للعلاقات بين الأعراق، وهو الأستاذ الجامعي أنثوني كوك. Welcome back to Dakhil, Washington. I'm sitting with Professor Anthony Cook talking about race and politics in America. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here.
Professor, the shooting death of Michael Brown has captivated America, provoked protests, riots, and even the intervention of the federal government. Why?
Well, race and politics in America is always, a potential explosive situation. So it's incendiary. It has been, for a very, very long period of time. And I think black people have been struggling in this country with dealing with problems of excessive force by police officers and police forces and with the brutality of the police force in their communities in many ways. And this particular incident just simply, illuminated, I think, a larger, more pervasive problem with the interaction between black and poor communities and police forces that goes on every day. The hope, I think, is that while this is not uncommon or unusual for the black community, that it becomes a window through which the rest of the country and the rest of the world can see just how much of a problem this is and can be mobilized around this issue to intervene to do something about these problems. That's the hope.
So let's take a look at some of the issues you just raised. Sadly, unarmed people get shot all over our country. Not frequently, but it happens all the time. Why did this incident, do you think, capture so much emotion and trigger so much of a response?
Well, whenever there's a situation, I think, given the history of race and racism, particularly in the criminal justice system, manifests itself, and it is a situation between a white police officer and a black individual, is going to get a lot of attention, particularly against the backdrop of the NAACP, the ACLU, other organizations that have kind of studied this issue and show, for instance, that blacks are disproportionately stopped by police officers. Once they are disproportionately stopped by police officers while walking or while driving, they are disproportionately searched, they're disproportionately brought into the police office, they are disproportionately prosecuted, they are disproportionately sentenced, and if they have committed a crime, or if they are believed to have committed a crime that justifies the death sentence, they are disproportionately put to death. There are injustices and inequities throughout the criminal justice system. America incarcerates more people than any other country on the face of the earth. And I'm talking about more than Russia, more than China, more than a lot of what we might call third world countries where dictators rule and we believe that the rule of law is not being observed or not being honored, right? This is America, the home of the free, the land of the brave. And we think that there's rule of law and justice here, when for a significant segment of the American population, that simply is not the case. And so when it happens in this kind of tension that is always present and is always potentially, disruptive between a black citizen and a white police officer, it's going to get that kind of attention, because historically that's simply just been the case. Blacks have been disproportionately and disparately treated within our criminal justice system.
To be a young black man in America, Michael Brown's story, how usual or how typical is Michael Brown's story in our country today?
I think surprisingly and unfortunately, quite typical. The ACLU did a report with regard to New York to...
The ACLU is the American Civil Liberties Union.
Yes, exactly. Conducted a long report in analysis in New York of the number of black people who were being, stopped by the stop and frisk policies of the New York Police Department. And they found that a disproportionate number of particularly black but also Latino males between the ages of 18 and 34 were targeted to be stopped. And this was alarming to some, not quite as surprising to others, because it is the day-to-day life and existence of so many people. Young black men, in America, they often have a target on their backs. And given the fact that they constitute in so many instances the low-hanging fruit of law enforcement agencies that are trying to enhance their numbers, their reputation, their efficiencies with regard to fighting the war on drugs, they become the target demographic to be picked up and to be imprisoned and to be, in many ways, just simply harassed. The stories now that we have coming out of Ferguson, paint a larger picture with regard to how this form of institutionalized racism, this disparate treatment that I've been talking about, takes place. Because an alarming number of Ferguson residents complain, it's been documented, how many have been stopped by the police for just kind of routine traffic violations or supposed traffic violations, harassed, tickets issued, unpaid, and it has become a conduit through which so many of those citizens have had to do jail time as a result of this kind of uber police force that imposes itself in a very relentless and very, very problematic way on the citizens of that city.
Well, I'm interested that you brought your explanation back to Ferguson, because I wanted to ask you, if we asked how typical Michael Brown's story is, how typical is Ferguson as a small American town and its relations between blacks and whites?
Well, it's typical in many ways, I think, atypical in some other ways. In a situation where you find that there is a disproportionate number of black people who are the citizenry of an area. For instance, Ferguson is 67% black, I believe. But when it comes to the police force, I think there are only like 3 black people on the police force. When you look at the city council, I don't think there are any blacks on the city council. When you look at the school board that is governed by whites in the larger, predominantly white county and area outside of Ferguson, it is exclusively white. They had a black superintendent that they, discharged under, very, suspect circumstances, I think a few months ago. And so you find a majority of black people in this area really being governed by whites. How does that come to be? Well, there are several things that account for it. One has to do with, when you look at the election patterns and sites in Ferguson, many of the local elections are held in off seasons, in April and in May, as opposed to November and when other national offices or congressional offices are up for election. And historically it's the case with poor people and with any people that when you have elections that are held in those kind of off cycles or off months, there is lower voter turnout. Now, this is not to excuse the fact that the voter turnout is as low as it is in Ferguson, which I think in some elections has been as low as 2 and 4%. There's a lot of work to be done there, but still, institutionally, I think people who want to maintain power and be able to perpetuate that power over others, they know the tricks of the trade with regard to limiting voter turnout. NAACP and others have the National Association for Advancement of Colored People. They've looked into the kind of traditional chicanery that goes on during elections with regard to posting police officers, having sirens on, having barricades in place, so forth and on, to discourage black people from voting. This kind of thing goes on. When you combine that with an organizational structure of at-large voting, in which in many instances you are able to bring the white population into the voting district in order to vote for representatives, right? To minimalize the number of black people, even though they constitute a majority of Ferguson proper, then you have the makings of a school board now that is, exclusively white. These kinds of patterns, these kinds of institutional organizational patterns, right, provide the backdrop against which a majority of a population can be underrepresented in the official political institutions of the area. When that happens and is coupled with the kind of harassment by the police force that I described earlier, and with what the police force is doing, it creates frustration. It creates animosity and bitterness, right? And then all of a sudden, a young black man is gunned down. He's unarmed. He's shot 6 times, 2 times in the head. There are mixed witness accounts, but there are certain things that are facts that we know now, right? His body laid on that street for 4 hours or so. You can't imagine that even if a citizen had hit a deer, or if a dog had been struck down, and someone had called and said, we got a deer, we got a dog in the middle of the street. You can't imagine that the officials would not have gotten that deer, that dog out of the way, but yet they let a human being, lie on that pavement with family and friends in a state of hysteria for 4 hours or better. It's simply inexcusable. And then when that frustration bubbles to the surface and manifests itself in terms of, agitated responses and even riots, right? The response is disproportionate to the stimulant, the stimulus. They turn out in riot gear. They turn out in, with rifles that discharge bullets at 60 and 70 rounds per second. They turn out in MRAP tanks, right? That are tanks that are designed to protect individuals who are driving those tanks from individual explosive devices and various forms of missiles. In other words, they look like an occupying force in Afghanistan or Iraq, as opposed to the proper response against activity by citizens of the United States. It's very frustrating.
Okay. When we come back, we're going to talk more about the situation in Ferguson, Missouri, and more broadly, the challenge of race and politics in America today. My guest today is Professor Anthony E. Cook. Professor Cook is a professor of law at Georgetown University and one of America's leading experts on race relations, religion, and politics in America today. A magna cum laude graduate of Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of International and Public Policy, Professor Cook graduated from Yale Law School and practiced venture capital and corporate law. After postgraduate fellowships in ethics, morality, and public values, At Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and Harvard Divinity School, he began teaching at Georgetown, including a current course exploring the role of lawyers in social movements. He is the author of the book titled The Least of These: Race, Law, and Religion in American Culture, which looks at Dr. Martin Luther King's idea of the beloved community in the context of race, class, and cultural divides in American society. For his work as a scholar and community activist, the American Bar Association honored Professor Cook as one of 21 lawyers leading America into the 21st century. So, Professor, many of our viewers may think of the stories that you've just described as being stories from the Deep South. But Ferguson, Missouri is not in the Deep South. It's just outside St. Louis, which is a Midwest American city. How wrong is that conventional thinking that the stories that you've just described are limited to what people used to call the Deep South?
Yes. Well, I grew up in the Deep South in a small, quaint town called Magnolia, Mississippi, which happened to be at the maelstrom of a lot of the civil rights activities in the 60s, where Medgar Evers was organizing and where Bob Moses and many of the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee members assembled to fight for justice. The Freedom Summers were, Mississippi was a focus of the Freedom Summers and the Freedom Rides in many ways. And one of my earliest childhood memories was actually coming out of my house one night, because our church was located right across the road from our house, and seeing a cross on fire where the Ku Klux Klan had set the cross on fire. Churches were the targets in many ways of the Ku Klux Klan and individuals who did not agree with the civil rights movement and its aims, because that's where that's where people organized, that's where they met, that's where they felt safe, that's where the institutional resources were in many ways, right? So many of our churches were bombed and, you know, windows broken and pastors kidnapped and mistreated and sometimes shot and killed. All of this was happening. I was a very young kid, so I did not, when I came of age, all of that was over. And so during the period of time that I lived in my hometown, I've got to tell you, I did not experience one instance of overt racism during that period of time. Of course, institutionally, when I look back on it, it was all there. When we started the process of integration, we had an actual affirmative action program for whites because they became the minority. And if we had a black student council president one year, the next year it had to be white. We had a homecoming queen that was black one year, the next year it had to be white. In an environment where the student population was 65% black and 35% white, affirmative action programs were set up in place for whites. But you know, we were trying to get along, and we never really protested about it, and we just kind of went along with that, right? When you look back on that, you see how all of that plays out. It was actually when I went to Princeton, New Jersey, my first year at Princeton, finishing up with a gospel choir rehearsal, and making our way to Route 1, me and one of my comrades, to get something to eat on a cold winter night, that we experienced New Jersey police officers who stopped us, brought us out of the car, stripped us of our coats and our clothing, and started to, you know, cuss us out, use all kinds of racial epithets, N-word this, N-word that, you know, calling us out of our name. We were scared to death. I had just, you know, really studied the whole history of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, the civil rights workers down in, you know, Neshoba County, Mississippi, and how they had been killed and buried beneath an earthen dam. They eventually put us back in the car, drove us across Route 1 into some cornfields, right? And we thought for certain that, you know, we were about to meet our end. They eventually resurfaced back onto Route 1, dropped us off, and it took us, you know, 30, 45 minutes crying, shaking in the cold to get our act together, to compose ourselves enough to even call someone, right? And so, you know, that was the first, so it reminded me of something that Malcolm X said when he said that the American South is anything south of the Canadian border. That the problem of race in America is a very pervasive one, and that it is not regionalized or localized in any particular area. And de Tocqueville, in his epic study of American democracy, you know, once pointed out that racism seemed to be more intense and more prevalent in areas that never had slavery to begin with. How was that, right? Sometimes there is a liberal paternalism that is at play, in which, as a society, we pat ourselves on the back for being so progressive, so open, so liberal, so non-racist, that we have failed to really interrogate the ways in which white privilege, right, constitutes an important, incredible component of maintaining a status quo, in which we don't really understand how these structures and institutions are patterned without intervention, without transformation, of perpetuating the legacy of slavery, segregation, and continued forms of subordination. In many ways, the failure to interrogate that in Ferguson, right, is at the root of some of these problems.
Professor Anthony Cook, thank you very much for joining me on Dakhil, Washington.
Thank you. My pleasure.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول العلاقات بين السود والبيض في أمريكا، أرجو أن تتصلوا بي مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elkhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.